Hey everybody, my name is Joshua Palmatier. I am an epic fantasy writer with books out from DAW, and I am also, more importantly, the founder of the small press Zombies Need Brains. And we are currently running a Kickstarter to fund 4 new themed science fiction and fantasy anthologies. Those are called Dragonesque, Game On, Artifice and Craft, and a solar punk anthology called Solar Flare. And I have here with me today the 2 editors for the Game On anthology, Tony Pi and Stephen Kotowych. And they're here to tell you guys exactly what they're looking for when it comes to the submission pile for Game On. So hopefully you'll be able to walk away with an idea of exactly what they want, and you can craft a story that will fit what they're looking for. And maybe you can be in the Game On anthology. So why don't you guys introduce yourself? We'll start with Stephen, I guess. Introduce yourself, and then we'll move on into the actual anthology.
Sure. I'm Stephen Kotowych. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy short stories. Published a bunch, won a few awards. I won the Writers of the Future once upon a time. I have one collection of short stories out so far called Seven Against Tomorrow, which is available if you want to pick that up. And I also host a podcast about the life and times of Nikola Tesla when I'm not writing fiction. So that's me.
Great. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I'm Tony Pi. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer. I write a lot of short stories, ranging from historical fantasy to we had a few science fiction as well. Yeah, I am a linguist. I have a PhD in linguistics. I also am a gamer, and I play lots of role-playing games as well as board games. I love trivia and things like that.
Okay, so obviously qualified to edit this anthology, both of you. Okay, so it's called Game On. I've been plugging the Kickstarter, saying it's all about games. So why don't you guys clarify that a little bit? What do you think of as the theme for the Game On anthology?
Yeah, so when we were first thinking about this idea, I mean, it occurred to me that we kind of live in a golden age of games and gaming right now. Everything from, tabletop role-playing games to, YouTube streams of people playing board games or playing video games online, board game cafes, all these sorts of things are present in the sort of popular culture in a way that I think is new. But I was struck by the fact that there's very little in the way of science fiction and fantasy anthologies that deal with games and gaming, given that games and gaming are a big part of a number of different franchises and different famous stories and books and things like that. So it struck me that an anthology about the role of games and game playing and games in culture was really, that there was really kind of a space for that, I think. So, and I think that it would be, I feel like if there were a Venn diagram of people who like science fiction and fantasy and people who are also pretty avid gamers of one kind or another, it would be pretty much a one-to-one overlap. So I thought it might be of interest to people who like this kind of stuff.
Hey, Tony, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in seeing games of all sorts from all sorts of cultures. Like in the kinds of games that I used to play in Taiwan, where I'm originally from, is different from games here in North America. I'm very eager to see what people can come up with, because there's so much variability. And once you add in science fiction and fantasy, it just triples the number of stories. So I want to see things from single player games to 2 players to 4 to even hundreds of players, and there are lots of media examples of that. So yeah, looking forward to what people can invent.
So you guys have been mentioning a lot of video games, but you don't want just video games, right? You want like board games and I've been saying RPGs in the advertisements and stuff are so what's the variety there that you would like?
I think I'd like to cast as broad a net as we can in terms of what is a game, what qualifies as a game. Certainly, Tony's quite right. Real world games from all corners of the world, various cultures, various historical time periods. I'd be interested in seeing stories that are focused around games that aren't really played anymore, like ancient Egyptian games, or even more recently, there was a card game called Whist that was very popular in like the 19th century that nobody really plays anymore. And that's just real world games. People shouldn't feel constrained to only have to play, something, a lot of, we don't want to get all kinds of space poker or space chess stories. Science fiction and fantasy offer a really broad palette. And in addition to real world games, I'd really like people to take advantage of that. So, I want to see games that are invented. What kind of games are played in, the land of fairy, or what kind of games do artificial intelligences play to pass the time in the far future, or, in the distant past, what sorts of games, might have magical cultures played or something like that. So I'm particularly interested in seeing a lot of really inventive, uses of the theme. But of course, remembering that we're not looking for stories that are a thinly veiled rules for a game. There has to be character, there has to be conflict, there has to be something for people to really be interested in other than just the rules of the game. I actually think it's probably possible to write a really good story for this kind of anthology, or that doesn't sort of mentions a game, hints at what the rules are. We don't need to be able to take the story and play a game of it right then and there, based on what we read in the story. I think that as long as it's illuminating character and tension and conflict, all the things you would want from a story, then I think it's going to be a solid submission, and hopefully something that we'd want to buy.
You haven't really mentioned something along the lines of like Hunger Games or Squid Game or something like that. Are you looking for things along those lines too?
I think it's all right, although it may go too much into sports, especially with Hunger Games, where you're very physical. So we're not looking for sports, but those that incorporate, physical activities are fine. Yeah. So just to add to what Stephen had said, like he covered, a broad range of what's possible and what we're looking for. I also like people to just think about whether or not something, a game from their past, is that game still alive and well, or has it had its time, or can it have a resurgence? So, for example, if I'm looking at my own, history of games, I loved pinball machines. But pinball machines have pretty much disappeared, but it played a pretty important role in my youth. Nowadays, we go to one of our fellow writers' home to play Star Wars pinball. That's about it. But it's just an example of something which was once very prominent and characteristic of era. We would like to see, stories set in that era, maybe reinvented. What is pinball like in the future? Just to take an example, and that could apply to any number of games that you can think of.
Okay, so my note is write a caveman game story to go too far into the past, and now write a future pinball story. Okay, I'm sure there's people out there that are taking notes just like that. Okay, so you want very, very wide spectrum in terms of the game, very wide spectrum in terms of the genre. So it can be basically, from what you said, I would say it could be any genre. But you don't want sports. Is there anything else that you don't want or that people should avoid that you can think of? I can think of one thing, but I want to know if you guys have something first.
Avoid the stories that the anchor authors have chosen. We had them each let us know what they're going to be writing about, just so that we don't have a lot of overlap, so that people can look a little further afield when they're just trying to decide what they want to submit. The big thing for me is that, you know, there needs to be a plot, there needs to be character. As I said before, you know, we don't want to see things that are just thinly veiled explanations of how to play an invented game. Other than that, you know, you mentioned, yeah, a broad range of genre. I think darker stories, or sort of, you know, horror stories are fine. I'm not super into horror, so something like that's really violent, or, you know, splatter punky or whatever, that's not going to be for me. But if it's something that is, you know, creepy and, you know, unnerving, makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I think that would be okay. And then, yeah, like you said, nothing really that qualifies as a sport. So, you know, no football, no rollerball, things like that. I think, but it'll be sort of, I think, up to Tony and my discretion as to what counts as a sport. I personally think that something like you know, a lethal reality show like the Hunger Games or like Squid Game, I think, you know, if it's done right, it could certainly have a place. But it'll be up to, we'll have to reserve judgment as to what qualifies and what might not.
Well, that's your job. You're the editor.
That's right.
Okay, so no rollerball inside a pinball machine in space. Okay. Anything to add to that, Tony?
I think the speculative element is important. It doesn't have to be a, you know, huge speculative element. We're okay with, you know, small stories with good characters and emotions, but maybe not a story that simply is retelling something which would happen in the real world. I think that's my only note to add to Stephen's.
Okay. Well, then from the publisher side of things, I would also have to add that we cannot accept any story from a highly licensed property because we do not have the money to afford the licensing fee or whatever it is that we would have to do. So, so, you know, we can't accept like a World of Warcraft story, or, you know, something along those lines. So if you're going to do a video game, you know, make sure it's not licensed or is a licensed property. Aside from that, I think we've covered everything that they should not do.
Just, John, could I just go back for one? So this is one thing I was thinking of, and you can tell me from your publisher's perspective if this is okay. So
yeah.
I think it would be possible to riff on you know, proprietary games that everybody knows, as long as you do it cleverly enough that you are clearly indicating what the game is without stepping on anything that might be copyrighted. So I could see you writing, say, a story about Monopoly without mentioning anything that would get a cease and desist letter from Milton Bradley. Like, does that make sense? Like, I could see it done really cleverly. I'm thinking particularly of a story. It's not a game story, but it's a story by a writer that Tony and I know, Matthew Johnson. It's called Heroic Measures. He has a collection, Irregular Verbs, and other stories that it's in, and it's clearly about Superman, but it never mentions Superman. And I remember him reading it at a convention we were at, and I just thought it was a tremendous story that really pulls off a really character-driven story that really pulls off that trick. So if somebody were to do that very cleverly and carefully, I wonder if that might work.
Yes, that would certainly work, especially if the story is coming off as like maybe satire or parody or something like that. But yeah, it would have to be done well enough that you know, you could tell what game you were actually talking about without, like you say, without actually saying this is Monopoly, and you know. But yes, something along those lines would be acceptable. Yes. Just, you know, even if you don't say it's Monopoly, you can't like say there's a get out of jail free card. You know, you can't even reference things in the game specifically that would be clearly only that game. But yeah. Let's see. You guys mentioned the other thing I wanted to mention, which was, you know, we none of us want an anthology where all of the stories are all about chess. So everybody should go to the Kickstarter and check out what games the anchor authors have actually claimed. None of them are chess. None of them are really off the wall, too much off the wall. So, well, that's not what I mean. None of them are really like standard games, I would say. I think the most standard one is euchre. So yes, definitely check and make sure that an anchor author isn't using your game, because in general, we're only going to want one story per game, and every now and then we'll accept two, but they have to be significantly different from each other. So like we might have two chess stories, but they got to be one wildly humorous and the other one really dark, or something along those lines. But in general, we don't like to have two or more of the same sort of theme.
I think people would do themselves a service in terms of their upping their chances of potentially getting in if they really try and think of something unique that they play, that they know of, that they can bring to the anthology. I do have a list that I sort of have compiled over the last little while, thinking of, well, what sort of categories of games that would be you could write stories about. So if the Kickstarter posts and we open up a submission window, then that's something I'm going to post on my website. So people at Kotowych.com, that people will be able to go and look for inspiration. Potentially, they might not have thought of certain categories of games. People might say, well, card games, board games, what else is there? But there's actually a really wide variety that I think people could draw from and get some really good stories out of.
Okay. That would be a good resource, yes. So definitely we need to point people toward that once we hit our funding and start the open call. And speaking of, if you're interested in this and you haven't backed the Kickstarter already, we definitely are looking for backers for the Kickstarter. As we film this, we have like 5 days left and we're still probably about 6,000 short. So we definitely need the funding. We're close. But head on over to the Kickstarter. It is at tinyurl.com/ZNB Kickstarter 2022. So again, that's tinyurl.com/ZNB Kickstarter 2022. Plenty of reward levels to choose from. It's really only $20 if you want all 4 of the new anthologies in ebook. So it's pretty cheap. $60 if you want them in the limited edition Kickstarter mass market version, so the paperback. But tons and tons of other reward levels you can choose from. Techorization, signed books, swag bags, all that kind of stuff. Okay. And hopefully we will hit our funding. If you're a writer, the minute we hit the funding, we will open up the submissions. And it runs until the end of December. So it's going to be done through Moksha. Okay, so there will be a link and all that kind of stuff once we hit funding. So thank you guys for stopping by and letting people know what you're looking for, give them a better chance of potentially getting into the anthology.
Thanks, Joshua.
Thank you.
Okay, see you guys all at the Kickstarter.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.